quad cores have been around for what feels like an eternity. Starting truly with the Core 2 quad lineup, we still have and use quad-core CPUs today. However, those chips are typically more budget-oriented, such as the i3-12100 or Ryzen 3 3200G. However, you only have to go back to 2017, where quad cores were as fast as a typical consumer could buy, and the only real differentiating factor between i5s and i7s was hyperthreading most of the time. Going back a bit further, we have this absolute unit of a gaming laptop. It has a quad-core CPU at its heart with a fun secret inside. It was crazy fast for the time. So, as you might have guessed from the title, today we will be reviewing the highest-end configuration, which was $2,400 by the way, for the Alienware 15R2. The reason why I brought up quad cores in the intro will become more apparent later on. This laptop here I bought to replace my old laptop, which, confusingly, was actually newer than this laptop. How I ended up with this configuration is a bit of an interesting story. I bought this laptop expecting it to be the 6700 HQ and GTX 980M config, but unfortunately it had the same CPU but with a 970M. But I wanted more. So what I did was I managed to find an eBay seller willing to accept the old logic board for 50% off on the highest end logic board for this laptop. So I took up the opportunity, and now I have a crazy good configuration now. Not to mention, more fun because of that special secret. Now, I might have had a bad night one time and my screen has a slight nick out of this polarization layer, but oh well. Anyways, let's go ahead and get right into the specs of this bad boy. This laptop, given the name, has a 15.6-inch 1080p IPS screen, with pixels responding so slowly, they make my VA display connected to my PC look fast. More on the display later though. The battery is quite large at 92 watt-hours and gets a whopping 50 minutes of gaming while on battery. But the battery in a gaming laptop, I feel, is more of a UPS than a battery at the end of the day. For sound, this has a dedicated headphone and dedicated mic jack, which is awesome. And what is even more interesting is that their functions aren't fixed. You can have 2 microphone jacks or 2 headphone jacks, all configured in software. It's weird and cool at the same time. The onboard sound chip is the Sound Blaster X-Fi NB3. It sounds okay, but it doesn't have all that much output power, but is by no means off. However, what is bad are the speakers. It has 2 front-firing, hollow-sounding, quiet speakers. Even my last laptop, which had a fair bit slower GPU, at least had a small subwoofer and didn't have hollow speakers. This laptop was configured with 16 GB of G.Skill 2133 MHz DDR4. And given the speed, I think that it was configured this as stock. The storage device, however, is very interesting. It's a hard drive, but it has 32 gigs of NAND flash on board that acts as a cache to make it a hybrid hard drive. It is certainly faster than a 2.5-inch hard drive has any right being, but it's no SSD. However, for the time, this was a great compromise between speed and storage space. The CPU inside of this laptop is very interesting. It is the very, very cool i7-6820HK. Yes, you heard that right. A K-series mobile CPU. And you bet your left mouse button we're gonna overclock it. Based on the 14nm Skylake architecture, it has 4 cores and 8 threads, and at stock has an all-core max boost speed of 3.2 GHz. The 8 MB of level 3 cache is actually rather nice to have on a mobile CPU of this vintage. The stock TDP as well is 45 watts, which is all well and good, but that is at its base clock. It supports DDR4 and has a 2-channel memory controller, as all consumer Skylake chips did. The CPU has a whopping 16 PCI Express lanes, which are running at Gen 3 speeds. The integrated graphics chip is the HD 530, but you don't care about that, unless you're somebody who uses QuickSync, which this actually does support. What you actually care about is the beast of a dedicated GPU that this thing had at the time. That beast is the NVIDIA GTX 980M. Based on the fantastic 28nm Maxwell architecture, it packs in 1,536 CUDA cores that run at a boost clock of 1123 MHz and 8 GB of GDDR5 VRAM with a 256-bit memory bus, which sounds kind of insane given the fact that the desktop GTX 980 only had half of that VRAM. However, unlike the desktop 980, this thing, as stated, has the CUDA core count of a slightly neutered GTX 970, which isn't amazing, really. There is no official TDP for this chip, but according to hardware info, it's drawing roughly 100 watts, give or take, under a full load. Now, I think that's enough out of me. It's now time for the gaming benchmarks. Now, I don't think this will be any surprise to anyone, but this thing is indeed capable of VR gaming. So we will be using the normal benchmark suite consisting of games tested in the Mac Pro review, with one exception. Seeing as how I recently picked up Bone Lab, I am now tossing that into the benchmark suite to beef up the VR tests I'm doing. Just to note here that I did not overclock the CPU, so this was running at the stock all-core clock speed of 3.2 GHz. So, starting off with Vivecraft, a VR mod for Java Minecraft, we see 38 FPS on average, with pretty decent lows at 24 FPS. That is already far more playable than the Mac Pro, and I haven't even done any overclocking yet. Elite Dangerous VR runs flawlessly with 59 FPS on average, and was a very consistent and smooth experience. Bone Lab actually didn't run all that great at 41 FPS on average, and I was genuinely surprised by that, as Bone Lab runs on the Quest 2 standalone. So the fact it didn't run too great here actually surprised me. And last up for the VR games is VR Chat, which didn't run the best at 29 FPS on average. And in this case, it was actually held back by the graphics card, which I was not expecting. So given how old this laptop is, it can actually do some pretty decent numbers for VR gaming, which is actually rather surprising to me. Because after all, you have to remember that the Quest 2 is basically 4K. I will note, though, that with the far more common 970M version of this laptop, you are very VRAM limited, which is something I noticed to be a serious issue on VR chat. Moving on to the more traditional games, we start out with Crossout, which ran fantastic at 94 FPS on average, with very consistent lows at 42 FPS. Avorion also ran flippin' great at 46 FPS in a late-game galaxy with a max-sized ship, with a ton of fighters, and another medium-sized ship in a very busy sector with a bunch of battles. BeamNG also ran really good at 88 FPS, and this config could handle 4 traffic cars and 5 parked cars, before the FPS dropped to unplayable levels. However, you cannot compare the number of cars to the Mac Pro due to a recent update optimizing traffic significantly. Rocket League ran really frickin' great as well, which is to be expected, at 150 FPS on average, with lows still fine, but getting down a bit to 60 FPS. And lastly, we have Shadow the Tomb Raider, which ran decently well at 46 FPS on average, with totally acceptable 5% lows at 40 FPS. So, funnily enough, a desktop replacement class gaming laptop from even this long ago still packs a pretty potent punch, even with the onboard dedicated graphics chip. However, that GPU is starting to feel its age nowadays, given a plebeian mobile GTX 1650 outperforms it in 3D Mark. Yikes. Something that I noticed during gaming is that the 980M, while having performance about smack dab in the middle in between a desktop GTX 1050 Ti and a 1063 gig, was drawing almost exactly 100 watts. So looking back, it's no wonder that people were hailing Pascal as the best architecture ever from NVIDIA, as Pascal was ludicrously more power efficient. The next set of benchmarks I have lined up for y'all today is productivity, so let's go ahead and see how it does there. Given how much this laptop cost back in the day, most people would want to do at least some level of productivity stuff on this machine. To find out just how good it does in that regard, we'll be using 3 benchmarks of choice today. Those being Cinebench R23, Blender Open Benchmark, and 3D Mark CPU Profile Benchmark. Starting out with Cinebench, we see a great single-core score of 930 points, but the multi-core score is really unimpressive at 3,674 points. In the Blender Open Benchmark, we see much of the same results with a score of 63.98 points, which puts it almost smack dab in the middle between an i5 9400F and a Ryzen 3 3200G. And lastly, with 3D Mark CPU Profile, we see an all-core score of 2,392 points, and with a single-core score of 613 points. Now, while the single-core score of this chip is higher than something like the Mac Pro, the lack of cores is actually starting to make a difference in the real world. With video editing, though, it is what I'd consider usable, if not a flawless experience. I would make a section on how it does with media consumption, but let's be real. If this laptop is this fast, any websites, content, or media consumed will work flawlessly with 0 issues. And that is indeed the case. This thing honestly did a bit better than I would have expected in productivity, to be completely honest, but I guess that's hyper-threading for you. I think it's time to say a final couple words about this thing before we end the video. The Alienware 15R2. A great laptop back then? Sure! A great laptop today? Not as much. Don't get me wrong, this thing is still very powerful given what it actually is. And after all, it is still what I consider a PC VR gaming capable machine that's only 34mm thick. But when you put into perspective that I spent $700 on this thing For the laptop, upgraded logic board, and the external graphics card dock, it doesn't make a ton of sense if you actually have games that need more than 4 CPU cores. However, the GPU was the more limiting factor here in almost every game. Yes, that even includes BeamNG. In my opinion, laptops are just not good value in general, at least when new. Used gaming laptops are where it's at in terms of value for mobile gaming, if you are somebody interested in that. Now, speaking about this laptop specifically, it's great if you only care about how many FPSs you get and the looks. The screen, trackpad, and speakers stink. But if you use it mainly at home in a docked battle station form, and occasionally go to a LAN party or something of the sort, this thing starts to make a fair bit of sense. Besides, for enthusiasts like myself, something about overclocking a mobile CPU to squeeze out as much performance as possible is super fascinating to me. Seeing as how I do have that eGPU dock, the next video will be exploring the wonders of overclocking a laptop CPU connected to a GPU that has no business being there. Well, that's it. If y'all enjoyed today's video, you can show your support by hitting the like and subscribe buttons, as well as that bell so you never miss a new upload. As always, I have a Patreon where you can support me to help me make more content just like this. Anyways, DDT out.